and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did not cover in this episode. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Sharon Zhou.
And I'm your other host, Andrei Kurenkov. In this episode, we'll be talking about funding for chip startups, new features at Google powered by AI, some results on using deep learning for dealing with physics equations and also analog AI, a bit about job automation and lawmakers looking into face scanning technology, and then a really funny story about an autonomous car that was pulled over by the police. Diving in, first up, we have our first story. Venture funding for chip startups has doubled in the last 5 years thanks to AI. And the story is pretty much what the title implies. There's been a really big surge in funding for startups dealing with creation of essentially novel chip infrastructure and designs. And that's largely due to these purpose-built semiconductor devices that are more specialized for AI and are not general purpose like what we typically have with CPUs and GPUs. So this article from protocol.com has quite a lot of details on this trend, and it's pretty interesting.
They have some pretty cool graphs too. So they show how deals have very much increased in amount from 2017 to today, and also how deal count hasn't necessarily gone up when it comes to chips. So it's really just funding soaring. And overall, I would say funding is generally soaring in AI and startups in general. They just cost more as rounds get bigger and bigger each year. And specifically, the article points out that, one of the most advanced NLP models, probably, GPT, will need 275 times the compute power every 2 years to work. And so these chip companies are very much doubling down on how to make this faster, especially when Moore's law right now is projected not to work with the physics. So we're going to have these specialized AI chips for this to work.
Yeah. I think we discussed some of these trends before a few weeks ago about the doubling of compute power and so on, how it's way outpacing what we've typically seen in the AI space. And so, as a result, this makes a lot of sense. The article, has some fun details. So, for instance, the funding has more than doubled, and concretely that means that in 2017, there were $800 million involved in funding for chip startups. And then in 2021, it was $1.8 billion. Lots of money being flown around, and some companies that are valued at a lot. For instance, Cerebras Systems is now at over $4 billion. So, quite, growing space, and I think both I and Sharon have probably seen bits and pieces of this and are curious to see where it goes.
Absolutely. And on to our next article. Google's multi-search feature lets you search with text and images at the same time. All right, so this is a feature that Google has rolled out. It's a new search feature, and you can actually enter both text and images at the same time to help with your search. And one of the most interesting things is that this is really pushing forward all that we've been talking about, multimodal models. And so this is making things even more personal, and you can, do something like take a picture of an orange dress and then add the word green to your search query and be able to get pictures of green dresses that look like, the shape or texture or something of the orange dress. So that's pretty cool that we're now seeing multimodal models get deployed en masse with Google, and specifically it's with the Google app called Google Lens, the feature, which, Andre and I hadn't really heard about since we use Google on our computers more. But yes, you can use this now. It's in beta.
Yeah, so as you said, kind of a neat demonstration of trying to push forward this multimodal stuff we've seen in research a lot to actual products. And it kind of reminds me of just VQA, visual question answering, which is a common task. But now you can take a photo of a dress and be like, I guess not ask a question, but find me a dress of this type of a different color. So I could definitely see this being useful for various things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's starting off with shopping now, but I could see this being useful. I definitely question kind of what the user experience is like, whether that's really intuitive, that's what's happening. But I'm curious to see this roll out and people use it.
Yeah. So cool to see more AI, coming out all the time, as always. And on to our lightning round, just a couple more stories we won't cover in depth. First up, we have nurse assisting robotics firm Diligent raises $30 million. So this is about the firm Diligent, which sells the Moxie robot to hospitals to assist nurses in carrying out tasks like carrying things and things like that. And as the title says, they have raised a new round of funding to try and expand, which is quite exciting, I think, because both I and Sharon know some of the people who founded it. So very cool to see their work going forward.
Congrats, Vivian, if you're listening. It is 30 million Series B from Tiger Global. And our next lightning round article is, sorry developers, Microsoft's new tool fixes the bugs in software code written by AI. So Microsoft just released Jigsaw, which can automate the process of checking and editing code outputted by a machine. And so, this is a next step of AI coming in to check and edit code, check for bugs. I love how the article starts with sorry developers, because I guess so many of us love that task. No, I'm kidding. It's just getting replaced.
Yeah. So now, you can use GitHub Copilot and then test it with another tool to make sure it didn't give you buggy code, which I guess is a good next step. And on to our research and advancements stories. First up, we have deep learning poised to blow up famed fluid equations from Quanta magazine. So this is a pretty hefty article, quite interesting, about a recent paper called Asymptotic Self-Similar Blow-Up Profile for 3D Euler via Physics-Informed Neural Networks. So a bit of a mouthful, as you can tell. And to put it into understandable terms, it's about this paper that has explored using a physics-informed neural network to study a very old system of equations or types of equations describing fluid dynamics. And with these types of equations, I guess one of the things mathematicians try to find are singularities, which is essentially when kind of you get impossible or nonsensical results like infinities and so on. And so there's been work to try and find if there are singularities that can result with these like fluid dynamic equations. So far, they haven't been found, and it's tricky because you basically need to simulate and compute, and it's hard to find them. And so this new paper that came out just a few months ago showed that you can use these physics-informed neural networks, essentially neural networks that are optimized with certain constraints, to then be able to, using some other fancy math I will not get into, the article actually does explain a lot of this, but it'll take a while to recap. Basically, they were able to pinpoint the way towards a singularity which has been kind of an ongoing effort by mathematicians all over. So, I guess a really interesting intersection between deep mathematics and physics and deep learning.
I'm really excited to see how, this is definitely a trend that's been happening around math and deep learning and accelerating our understanding of math moving forward. And I really think there are ways where these models can very much help our understanding with math and make breakthroughs in the future, especially since, some of our proofs might be, verifiable in some way. And so it's cool to see this really be able to make headway much further than perhaps things that require, much more human components or aren't verifiable easily just by looking at it. And so here, this is just one example of that.
Yeah, exactly. And the article also describes a bit how, at least in general, I guess in math, there's been a trend towards computer-assisted proofs. And, even outside of AI, just using computers to help find results. As you said, it's cool to see another demonstration of how this is possible.
And on to our next article, analog AI. It sounds crazy, but it might be the future. So this article is about an AI chip company called Mythic that is creating, the future of AI that is analog, which is, a kind of chip that is designed specifically for AI. Very much harks back to the earlier article we were talking about, how Moore's law is running into problems when it comes to physics, and so companies like Mythic are creating chips that can, in this case, handle the matrix multiplications in a neural network in an analog way. And specifically for this analog computing, for core neural network matrix operations, they're looking at they're looking at voltage in and current out to be able to do, say, a matrix multiplication. And so I feel like this is super cool, seeing how this will make it much cheaper and faster to run models, both on the edge, but also in the cloud.
Yeah. I think anyone who is kind of a computer science nerd would be intrigued. To just expand a little bit, they are going analog to the extent that, as far as I understand, there's basically no transistors, right? There's no bits involved here. It's not digital. And that's what our computers, all of them do, GPUs, CPUs, right? They're all based around bits and programs that are bits. And so matrix multiplication and addition are just sequences of operations on bits. And so it's not hard to imagine that if you just did addition via just straight up adding up two sets of voltages via a chip or circuit, and that's your addition, it'll be way faster. But so far that hasn't been really done, I guess, because digital is much easier to do in some sense. So would be really cool if this actually pans out. So
this would be really, really cool.
Yeah.
So, and they are now, piloting this with their first customers. So we'll see how that goes.
Indeed. And on to our lightning round. We have first up AI and infrared spectroscopy identify the age and species of mosquitoes. And so researchers in the UK and Africa have developed a quick and cost-effective way to determine the age of malaria mosquitoes using this mid-infrared spectroscopy. And I guess the use of AI there helps analyze the data. And so that's important to assess the effectiveness of control interventions, since only older mosquitoes can transmit malaria.
And our other article is Deep Science, combining vision and language could be the key to more capable AI. And so this article it talks about how there's new research showing signs of encouraging progress from robots that can figure out steps to satisfy basic commands like get a water bottle to text producing systems that learn from explanations. And this is very much, this is a TechCrunch article that very much is an overview of a lot of articles that we have touched on in the past together.
Yeah, and then it also touches on this new paper that is related to all these articles called SayCan as one of them. So SayCan just came out from Google and Everyday Robotics, and basically uses these things like GPT-3 to, in some sense, do common sense reasoning or decision making for robotics. Really cool paper, yeah. So good article to check out if you're curious. And on to our society and ethics stories. First up, the miserable lives of cyborg truck drivers from 1.0. So this article is a bit of an overview of the overall idea that AI and automation are not costing people jobs yet. Employment in things like trucking, where people are predicting automation will cost jobs, is still rising, but the actual job quality is going down. And that's in part because of new automated kind of management techniques, basically surveillance. And we've heard some of this before, where you have, sensors inside the truck that automatically check if the engine is turned off at night. Different electronic logging signals that monitor when the truckers are driving, so that they're known when to be paid. And now there's even more, like cameras that point at their faces and microphones recording audio, which are possibly or likely powered by AI to detect what is happening with the driver. So basically, the article goes over all of this stuff and asserts that even though jobs aren't being lost, they are getting worse because automation AI are kind of becoming these automated managers that enforce the workers to be, incredibly efficient.
Yeah, this is really sad to see how, AI is not good enough to actually do the job, but it is good enough to do surveillance and only surveillance. And so that's how it's like micromanaging, I guess, some of these people, and beyond micromanagement, like not giving them a break beyond the role. Otherwise, that otherwise a human would, and basically understanding like the human side of things and the exceptions that come with the human side of things, that these more rigid, I guess, systems don't have that human touch. And so that's quite unfortunate about what's happened as a result.
Yeah, and you can easily imagine this kind of thing being commonplace in factories and all these working conditions that are hard enough as is. So, it's not a nice thought, and hopefully, unions or lawmakers will be able to kind of do some sort of regulation to make sure it's not too dystopian.
And on to our next article. House lawmakers launch investigation of face scan contractor ID.me. And so last Thursday, House lawmakers launched an investigation into the efficacy and security of the identity verification contractor ID.me after government agencies were using it, including the IRS, which we covered earlier. And so this was a 10-page letter that was addressed to the CEO of ID.me, and it was lawmakers requesting that the company turn over very detailed records about its contracts with different governments at the local, state, and federal levels. And looking into potential inaccuracies in its systems, because there was, serious concerns that all of these federal agencies, about 10 federal, 30 state governments were contracting with ID.me and specifically using the facial recognition service. And so this is, an escalation of years of controversy over the government's growing use of facial recognition. And this really boiled over this year after the IRS said it would require Americans to scan their faces to access their tax accounts. And this has been, bipartisan since 2019, but things have been stalled since then. But now it's really picked up again. And ID.me said it would drop the facial recognition requirement for all federal and state agencies as a result. And the IRS said it would try to transition away from this service. And in February, just so you know the extent of this, the company said that 73 million people had used the service, but of course would be able to delete their selfies or photo data. There's a lot of money going into this, and the IRS would have to terminate, if it would really want to move away, terminate its $86 million contract with ID.me.
Wow. Yeah, really interesting developments. It's kind of impressive that all this came about because of this controversy that happened over the IRS login stuff. And now, it turns out that ID.me has been used by a bunch more of the government. It has had some seeming accuracy issues and delays and things like that. So at least, hopefully, this would, this investigation could improve how both the federal and state governments use these kinds of technologies. Perhaps even lead to regulation, although who knows how long that'll take. But still, interesting outcome.
Yeah, definitely very, very interesting outcome, and definitely accelerating, AI regulations in the space at the federal level.
Yeah, and on that note, actually going to our lightning round, we have the story: Biden administration takes step forward on AI policy. So the Department of Commerce has appointed more than 24 experts to a committee that will advise President Joe Biden on AI policy. And we've seen this as a bit of a trend that the federal government has been establishing kind of more tech savvy positions, including with respect to AI. So this was actually a direct order from the National AI Initiative Act of 2020. So, and this committee will include executives from companies like Google, Salesforce, NVIDIA, Microsoft, as well as some academics from universities such as Stanford and so on. So, interesting.
And our next article is FDA issues advisory on use of AI machine learning for large vessel occlusion in the brain. The FDA basically said that some radiologists might not be aware of the intended use of triage and notification devices that use AI, and has issued an advisory on the use of imaging software specifically for patients with suspected LVO, large vessel occlusion in the brain, which is common for stroke. And on to our next section, fun and neat. The first article is GM Cruise autonomous taxi pulled over by police in San Francisco without humans, bolts off. All right, so this is a pretty hilarious situation where a autonomous taxi or cruise vehicle operated by GM and Cruise didn't have a driver and was pulled over by the SF police department. And actually, after pulled over, it kind of then tries to move, take off, as people say. Cruise did respond that it wasn't taking off; it was trying to pull over to the next safest location from the traffic stop as intended. And it's a really funny video. I encourage you to go look at it. You see the officers not knowing exactly how to handle this situation because there's no driver, and it's really funny. It feels like, the transition between now and the future.
Yeah, it's quite amusing for sure. And Cruise responded to it, and basically the vehicle was operating as it was supposed to. It yielded to a police vehicle and then pulled over to the nearest safe location. But the officer clearly didn't expect that or didn't understand that's what happened. And so it all ended up looking pretty comical. And this was just shot by some bystander on the street. And we found out, and Sharon found out, that Cruise has this whole 15-minute long video for police officers and other first responders on how to interact with these autonomous cars. So definitely not the first time we'll see something like this, I think.
Definitely not the first time. Pretty funny. I think it looks like it's taken off because, normally for a human, they would say, okay, I'll pull over there. Or, there would be a little bit of a back and forth there of what to do. But since there was no verbal feedback or anything, not even, you can't really point to where it would then meet again, that it looked like it was about to just take off after the officer talked to it and went back to his own police car. So that it's a really funny interaction.
Yeah, it really drove off quick, which was, check it out. We'll have a link as usual in the episode description, or you can just Google it. GM Cruise bolts off, you'll find it. Also, I think I said this is not the first time. This is not the last time, is what I mean. We'll see more of these kinds of incidents soon enough, I imagine. And then on to our last pretty neat story. This is actually a YouTube video that is a bit fun, and it's just how AI helps students learn. And it's talking about an initiative in California that uses AI to help students review stuff they've learned and kind of customize what they're shown. And it's kind of like a more advanced version of Duolingo or something like that, where the AI can help guide what you review and how you review and so on. So kind of a fun video just to see kids interacting with stuff and see how it affects young people. But not quite as funny as the last one, for sure.
Not as funny, but I really like how they had a user actually give his own testimonial of how the AI was working, how the system was working. And he basically said it knows what topics I should really learn as it adapts to his learning pace.
Yeah, exactly. So I think definitely as we all are getting used to the post-COVID reality that probably online education and I guess digital assisted education makes sense. I do hope there's more of these sort of intelligent AI powered kind of learning platforms. I do believe it might be quite beneficial.
And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at lastweekin.ai. Just subscribe and leave us a review, leave us a rating, and tune in and tell your friends to tune in.
Yes, do that. That was zoning out. But yes, subscribe or tell your friends to subscribe and review the podcast and keep listening and all that.